When someone goes cold without warning, we tend to ask the wrong question. We ask, "What did I do?" We replay every word, every pause, every moment where we might have misstepped. But the truth is, sudden emotional distance is rarely about a single action. It's about what someone no longer has the capacity to hold. When someone suddenly turns emotionally cold, our instinct is to look inward and assume responsibility. We replay conversations, analyze tone, and search for the moment where we believe we must have done something wrong. But more often than not, sudden emotional distance has very little to do with a specific action or mistake. It reflects something much deeper, a person's capacity or lack of capacity for vulnerability. Vulnerability requires the ability to stay present when emotions become uncomfortable. It asks us to tolerate uncertainty, to name what we feel before it hardens into silence. Not everyone has learned how to do this. For some people, emotional closeness activates fear rather than safety. As connection deepens, expectations increase, and the unspoken question arises, can I be seen here without losing myself? When the answer feels uncertain, withdrawal becomes the default response. Emotional coldness is often a learned survival strategy. Many people grew up in environments where feelings were ignored, dismissed, or punished. In those spaces, openness didn't lead to understanding, it led to conflict or shame. Over time, shutting down became a way to stay in control. Distance felt safer than expression. So when intimacy invites honesty, the nervous system reacts as if danger is near, even when nothing is actually wrong. This is why sudden withdrawal can feel so confusing. One moment, connection feels alive, the next, it's distant and unreachable. But that shift is rarely triggered by something you did. It's triggered by what the connection began to require: presence, accountability, or emotional risk. When someone hasn't built the inner tools to meet those moments, they retreat, not because the bond lacks value, but because it demands more than they know how to give. Understanding this matters, because without it, we internalize someone else's limits as our own failures. We begin to believe that being quieter, easier, or less honest might keep people close. But shrinking yourself does not create safety, it only delays the truth. The truth is that emotional availability isn't about liking someone enough, it's about having the capacity to stay open when things become real. When someone goes cold, let it be information rather than self-blame. It tells you where their emotional ceiling is, not where your worth ends. Real connection isn't sustained by perfection. It's sustained by the willingness to remain vulnerable, even when it's uncomfortable. And anyone who cannot do that is showing you their limits, not your inadequacy. When feelings become overwhelming, not everyone moves toward conversation. For many people, the instinct is to pull away, to go quiet, to create distance where closeness once lived. This withdrawal is not always intentional or cruel. Often, it is a protective response, an automatic attempt to regulate emotions that feel too big, too confusing, or too risky to express out loud. Emotional overwhelm happens when inner experiences outpace our ability to process them. Thoughts pile up, fear mixes with desire, and uncertainty takes over. In these moments, communication can feel dangerous. Speaking requires clarity, and overwhelm offers none. Instead of risking saying the wrong thing or revealing too much, silence feels safer. Distance offers temporary relief from the pressure to explain feelings that haven't yet formed into words. For many, withdrawing is a learned behavior. It develops in environments where emotions were met with dismissal, conflict, or punishment. If expressing needs once led to being misunderstood or shamed, the nervous system adapts. It learns that retreat equals safety. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. When emotional intensity rises, the body doesn't ask, "How can I communicate?" It asks, "How can I escape?" This is why withdrawal can feel so abrupt to the person on the receiving end. There may be no warning, no explanation, just a sudden shift in energy. But what looks like indifference is often internal chaos. The person pulling away isn't calm, they're overloaded. They're trying to regain control by reducing emotional input, even if it costs connection. The problem is that withdrawal protects in the short term but damages in the long term. Unspoken feelings don't disappear, they harden into distance. What could have been a clarifying conversation becomes confusion and hurt. The absence of communication leaves room for self-doubt, misinterpretation, and emotional erosion on both sides. Understanding this doesn't mean excusing the behavior. Compassion and accountability can coexist. While withdrawal may explain why someone goes quiet, it doesn't make silence harmless. Healthy connection requires learning how to stay present with discomfort, to say, I need time, rather than disappearing, or I'm overwhelmed, instead of shutting down. When feelings become overwhelming, the real work isn't avoidance, it's building the capacity to remain open. Communication doesn't require perfect words, only honesty. And relationships that endure are not built by those who never feel overwhelmed, but by those who choose connection even when retreat feels easier. Emotional distance is often misunderstood as a lack of care, a quiet signal that someone no longer feels invested. But more often, distance is not indifference, it is armor. It is what people reach for when they don't feel safe enough, skilled enough, or brave enough to speak the truth of what they are experiencing. In those moments, silence becomes a substitute for honesty, not because honesty doesn't matter, but because courage feels out of reach. For many people, expressing emotions has never felt safe. Honesty may have once been met with rejection, conflict, or minimization. Over time, the body learns that staying quiet reduces risk. Emotional distance becomes a shield against vulnerability, a way to stay protected when connection feels too exposing. Rather than saying, I'm afraid, or I don't know how to handle this, they pull back. The armor goes on, not to hurt someone else, but to prevent being hurt themselves. Silence often appears when feelings grow complicated. When affection mixes with fear, or responsibility clashes with desire, people can feel trapped between wanting connection and fearing its cost. Naming that tension requires emotional bravery. It requires acknowledging uncertainty and risking disappointment. When that courage isn't available, withdrawal feels like the safest option. Distance creates space where no explanation is required and no vulnerability is demanded. This is why emotional distance can feel so painful to receive. It offers no context, no reassurance, no closure. The absence of words leaves room for self-blame and confusion. But silence is rarely a statement of worth. It's a signal of someone reaching the edge of their emotional capacity and choosing protection over presence. The tragedy of emotional armor is that it keeps both people lonely. While it shields the one wearing it from discomfort, it also blocks genuine connection. Honesty, even when messy, invites understanding. Silence invites interpretation, and interpretation almost always leans toward self-doubt. What could have been navigated together becomes something carried alone. Recognizing emotional distance as armor changes how we respond to it. It allows us to hold compassion without abandoning self-respect. We can understand why someone went quiet without chasing them into their silence. Because while courage cannot be forced, boundaries can be chosen. Real connection requires more than feelings. It requires the willingness to show up when feelings are hard. When someone chooses silence over honesty, they are revealing not a lack of care, but a lack of access to courage in that moment. And knowing the difference helps us stop taking distance personally and start choosing relationships where honesty doesn't require armor to survive. When someone goes cold, the first wound is often the one we inflict on ourselves. We translate their distance into a story about our worth. We assume we asked for too much, felt too deeply, or showed up too honestly. But someone else's withdrawal is not a measure of your value. It is a reflection of how they respond to discomfort, especially emotional discomfort. Discomfort shows up when connection deepens. It arrives with expectations, accountability, and the need for clarity. It asks people to sit with uncertainty, to navigate feelings that don't fit neatly into certainty or control. Not everyone knows how to do that. For some, emotional tension triggers old fears of conflict, inadequacy, or loss of autonomy. When those feelings surface, distance becomes a way to escape the internal pressure. Going cold is often a strategy, not a verdict. It is how some people regulate themselves when emotions feel overwhelming. Instead of naming confusion or fear, they shut down. Instead of risking a difficult conversation, they retreat. This doesn't mean the connection lacked meaning. It means the connection asked them to engage in ways they weren't prepared for. The danger comes when we personalize their response. When we mistake someone's emotional limits for our own shortcomings, we start negotiating against ourselves. We minimize needs, justify silence, and accept ambiguity in places where clarity is deserved. Over time, this erodes self-trust. We become more focused on staying chosen than on staying whole. Understanding that someone going cold reflects their relationship with discomfort restores balance. It reminds us that emotional availability is a skill, not a guarantee. Some people have learned to move toward hard feelings, others have learned to avoid them. Neither is a moral failing, but it does define compatibility. A relationship can only grow as far as both people are willing to stay present with discomfort. This perspective allows compassion without self-abandonment. You can acknowledge their struggle without shrinking yourself to accommodate it. You can hold empathy while still honoring your need for communication and warmth. Your worth does not fluctuate with someone else's capacity. You do not become less deserving because someone chose distance over dialogue. When someone goes cold, let it clarify rather than condemn. It shows you how they manage emotional strain, and it invites you to choose relationships where discomfort is met with courage, not withdrawal, and where your presence is valued, not avoided. Healthy connection is often misunderstood as the ability to endure to tolerate silence, inconsistency, or emotional distance in the name of loyalty or patience. We're taught, subtly and loudly, that staying through discomfort is proof of love. But real connection is not built on endurance. It is built on communication. Presence matters far more than perfection, and without it, even the strongest feelings begin to erode. Endurance asks us to survive relationships. Communication asks us to participate in them. When we endure, we absorb confusion, minimize needs, and wait for things to improve on their own. We tell ourselves that if we are patient enough, understanding will arrive. But unspoken tension doesn't resolve itself, it accumulates. What is left unsaid slowly becomes distance, and distance is rarely healed by time alone. Presence, on the other hand, means showing up emotionally, even when things are messy. It means being willing to say, "I don't have this figured out, but I'm here." Healthy communication doesn't require flawless language or perfect timing. It requires honesty and a willingness to stay engaged. Being present means choosing dialogue over disappearance, even when the conversation feels uncomfortable or incomplete. Perfection creates pressure. It convinces people they must have the right words before speaking, the right emotions before engaging. When perfection becomes the standard, silence often follows. But relationships don't need polished explanations, they need human ones. A simple acknowledgement of struggle is often more healing than a carefully crafted response delivered too late. Endurance can keep a connection alive on the surface, but it starves it underneath. People who endure without communication often feel lonely inside their relationships. They may be physically present but emotionally unseen. Over time, this leads to resentment or detachment, not intimacy. Healthy connection invites mutual responsibility. It asks both people to take emotional risks, to listen as much as they speak, and to remain available even when clarity is still forming. It recognizes that misunderstanding is inevitable, but avoidance is optional. Presence doesn't mean never failing. It means returning, repairing, and remaining open. When communication is valued over endurance, relationships become spaces of growth rather than survival. Because what sustains connection is not how much you can tolerate, but how willing you are to show up, imperfectly, honestly, and consistently. When things get real, when emotions deepen, questions surface, and vulnerability becomes unavoidable, the true nature of connection is revealed. The right people don't vanish at this point. They don't retreat into silence or leave you guessing where you stand. Instead, they lean in. Not because it's easy, but because they understand that real connection requires clarity and courage, especially when comfort fades. Disappearing is often a response to fear. It's what happens when intimacy asks for accountability or when feelings demand to be named. But the right people recognize that uncertainty doesn't disappear through avoidance. They know that silence creates more harm than honesty ever could, so they choose presence over escape. They may not have perfect answers, but they are willing to stay engaged while finding them. Leaning in doesn't mean never struggling. Courage and connection looks like admitting confusion instead of hiding it. It sounds like, "I'm unsure, but I want to talk," or "This is hard, and I don't want to avoid it." Clarity is not about having everything resolved. It's about being transparent about where you are. The right people offer that transparency because they respect both themselves and the relationship. When someone leans in, they communicate even when the message is uncomfortable. They understand that clarity is an act of care. It prevents unnecessary self-doubt and honors emotional investment. Choosing courage means risking vulnerability rather than protecting oneself with distance. It means trusting that honesty, even when imperfect, strengthens connection rather than destroys it. This is how emotional safety is built, not through constant harmony, but through consistent presence. Knowing that someone will stay when conversations get hard creates trust. It allows both people to be fully human without fear of sudden abandonment. Over time, this reliability becomes the foundation of intimacy. The right people don't demand that you perform or diminish yourself to keep them close. They don't disappear when you express needs or ask questions. They meet you with openness, even when the answers are complex or uncertain. That willingness to engage is what separates meaningful connection from temporary attachment. When someone disappears as things get real, let it be information. And when someone leans in with clarity and courage, recognize it for what it is, not perfection, but emotional readiness. Real connection isn't defined by how smoothly things go, it's defined by who stays present when they don't.